a dung beetle, but I'm like, this is incredible, right? These creatures exist to like recycle this stuff, and it's what allows for life. So I really think a lot of it comes down to how you tell the story. And you get an extra boost when it is accurate.
But what if the story is that the dung beetle doesn't exist? Like the story with the black holes, right? Right. The story with the black holes is not that there is some like explanation for them. It's like, you guys, this is a mathematical artifact that is the result of pushing your equations past the point of their solutions, getting some kind of mathematical impossibility, and then instead of recognizing that you've reached
physical impossibility, mathematical construct is fine.
Yeah, exactly. Like you get to something that is pure mathematics, that is not applicable to the natural world, and instead of saying this is the edge of what we can do, you're like, impossible object.
First of all, this is totally my favorite podcast of all time, because I'm obsessed with how math becomes this like weird self-replicating psychosis, and so I could totally buy. I don't know enough, by the way, about black holes or the physics of black holes to say that I know whether or not black holes are or not a mathematical kind of artifact. But I would totally, by the way, I would totally buy that. I would say to your earlier question about what do you do about the dung beetle is the most sublime play in the history of English literature is Shakespeare's King Lear. And the entire point of Shakespeare's King Lear is burn it down. Burn it down. Off you lendings is like a famous line in the play. And basically what King Lear goes through is all of these illusions that humans have created to make themselves feel important. And it wipes them out step by step by step. And at the time that it was premiered, it was so overwhelming for people that they couldn't stand it. They were just like, it was like looking at the sun. And so it was basically thrown off the stage. Then it was rewritten as a comedy for over 100 years. And then it came back. And if you go watch a performance of King Lear now, it has this radical experience that you're talking about of being ushered into a world where everybody believes in black holes. And then all of a sudden somebody steps forward who's obviously a lunatic because they don't believe in black holes. And then step by step by step, you become the lunatic and the black holes vaporize. And that's sublime. Now, what that's teaching you, however, just to be clear, is not something about the nature of the universe. It's teaching you something about the nature of the human mind and history and so on and so forth. So I'm not going to feel that the disintegration of black holes is sublime in the sense of me learning something about the universe. I'm going to feel that's sublime in the sense of teaching me something about contemporary science or whatever. You'd still have to replace that with something else, right? I mean, presumably there's something else out there, if not black holes, and that can be sublime. But as long as you're on board with the idea that burning things down can be an aesthetic experience, you're totally fine.
Yeah, it kind of brings me to this other point, which is that not only do I like trying on these ideas with experts, but some of my best friends are just normal people who aren't scientific at all. I mean, I do a ton of music. I have my whole life, so I have a lot of friends that I've just played in bands with over the years. And I love trying on these really uncomfortable scientific ideas with normal people too, because again, I get each time it's almost an experiment in, am I telling this with the most important part forward? Because if I just start into the what's changing in my mind, like what will change or whatever, it almost, you can see their eyes kind of roll back in their head. Like they just haven't, they're not paying attention because the emotional grab isn't there for them of why this matters to them. And oftentimes I'll ramble for 10 minutes and then they'll be like, yeah, but like, even if what you're saying is true, like who cares? Like, how's this gonna affect me? I work in a donut factory or whatever. And so if I had to talk to you about black holes right now, I'd derail at least the next 45 minutes, right? And I don't want to do that because I haven't nailed that narrative in my mind yet about how to lead with these things. And I want to really badly. And I hope like 10 years from now, I'll be way better at it than I am right now. And I certainly used to suck a lot more before I started in, even just doing a PhD. If I got anything out of doing a PhD, it was how to present a story in a compelling way, ultimately. But sorry, I'm kind of rambling here.
This is great. So one of the things that I think is really important is communicating to quote unquote ordinary people why science is sublime. And I think that is something that we are sort of losing the art of for a variety of reasons. I mean, so first of all, one of the reasons we're losing the art of it is because science itself has kind of become a cult. And so, as you get kind of, and I say as a scientist, as you
say that with love.
As you get into the cult, you start using all these kinds of like terms and terminologies, all these assumptions, and so you fail to be able to communicate outside of the cult. You're in sort of this little bubble, and the cult might be right. You might be worshiping the real black hole, but it's still a cult in the sense that you can't kind of get outside your own kind of language game, essentially. Then the next problem is that over the last 50 years, there's been this well-intentioned but kind of like pernicious growth of popular science, which is explaining science to ordinary people. And it always proceeds along the sort of the same steps, which is let me find some incredibly banal metaphor that makes you feel a sense of like understanding that's way too fast and way too simple. And now you've mastered it and you can move on. And, in my own field of neuroscience, this sort of culminated with people being like, and this is the part of the brain where you're angry. And this is the part of your brain where you fall in love, and people would just like go, and people would like, wow, that's amazing. I feel like I've learned so much about my brain. Now I'm going to go have lunch. So you've got the fact that science is a cult. Then you've got the fact that, we have this expectation that science communication should be this incredibly basic thing involving these incredibly simple analogies that make totally bonkers and bizarre features of our natural world seem immediately comprehensible to people. And, so people have this, very short attention span as a result of this. What I think we need to do is we need to learn from the artists. So what sparked the Renaissance was the ability of people, like Michelangelo, like Shakespeare, like whomever, to start to attract ordinary people into the idea that there was something more. That's the first step. Not trying to convince them what the something more is, but just trying to convince them that there's something more. And as you start to edge people into something more, they start to feel this dual sensation of curiosity and also terror, because they're like, what is it? That's kind of interesting. But also, wait a minute, what is this destroying about my own sense of stability? We know that people like this experience because of horror movies. Horror movies just remain the most popular movies of all time. You can make them for a couple $1 million, and they make hundreds of millions of dollars. All other forms of cinema have basically collapsed in terms of profitability. Horror movies hang on because they're all about that confrontation with the unknown, that sense there's something more. So the first thing is just to start to get people into that place where they're like, there is something more. And then their natural sense of curiosity will make it valuable to them. And that little bit of the edge of terror will start to excite their sort of full cognitive capacity. So they'll be quite open, So I would say that's really the thing. And the reason that this comes from art is because art is all about trying to give you a single moment of experience. And then once you have that single moment of experience, you can then start to translate that into a narrative. But it's that moment of experience that comes first. And that moment of experience is typically a rupture in a profound way with the way that they are experiencing the world now. Now, I don't know how to do that with black holes, because I'm not sure exactly how black holes are intersecting with people's ordinary reality, but I know it must be possible because Christopher Nolan, who I personally dislike intensely as a filmmaker, has nevertheless had an incredibly successful series of films that are based on things like black holes and whatnot. So there must be like a large community of people who on enough of a kind of emotional level see themselves as relating to these cosmic phenomena that you could start to go in and kind of trouble them there and create the emotional opportunity for change.
I have this feeling that there are two metaphysical starting points. And so the way that I use metaphysics, Shiloh's always on me about this because he's like, nobody else uses that word that way. And so the way that I use it is that it is the set of starting assumptions that you make about the world. And so like Lord of the Rings has a different set of metaphysics than Star Wars, because the metaphysics of Lord of the Rings is orcs and dragons and flying eagles. The metaphysics of Star Wars is lightsabers and Han Solo and Chewbacca and whatever.
Don't all eagles fly?
They're very large eagles that are big enough to carry a hobbit. Giant eagles that the wizards can talk to. So there is a set of people in... actually, I don't agree with that. I think that everybody needs some place to put their belief that the world has the capacity for magic. I do not think that there's a single human being, no matter how rational they are, that is happy to live in a world that has nothing sublime or supernatural in it. And what happens is that the super rational are right now able to put their need for the supernatural into fundamental physics, and because they cannot put it into the spirit or the will or the art or any of these other things. And so we have this weird creep of metaphysics, where the metaphysics that belong into the supernatural stories are creeping into the, purportedly rationalist stories that we're telling. And then there's this weird mixture. And so when you go to somebody who believes in themselves as being this rational, logical expert in how the world works, and you tell them, well, hold on a second, like the supernatural doesn't belong in there. They're like, well, there's nowhere else to put it. Like, what do you, there's not, like, we need aliens, we need black holes, we need these impossible stars that are 40,000 times denser than the densest element on Earth, because our immense evolutionary need for some kind of magical story about the fact that the world is beyond our comprehension cannot be abandoned.
This is really fascinating to me. I might be one of the few people that has no need or desire for the supernatural, or I may be lying to myself about that, and I may actually have a secret need or desire for the supernatural.
The way that you talk about art is where it sounds like that's where you put it. Your relationship to I think the sublime has a little supernatural edge to it, where it's this sense of just awe and wonder and...
Oh, yeah.
I think in some ways,
people have a need for spiritual experience. I would totally agree there.
Okay, let's say that.
But that's a biological need, I guess. So at the bottom of the need for spiritual experience is biology. I feel like a lot of times, if you're a biologist, you have less need for these things than other people because biology is already so weird, and there's already so much of this, like giant eagles and stuff happening, and then all of a sudden we discovered like hobbits are actually real and they were like living over in Indonesia, 60,000 years ago. So maybe as biologists, just if you have a kind of biological background. But I mean, I think that going back to what I was saying before, and I think kind of what you're saying, people do have this problem with death and their own mortality. And I think some people successfully wrangle that and some people don't. And I think if you don't wrangle that, it makes you much more prone to supernaturalism because you start to get really anxious about the limits of yourself. Whereas if instead you're like, actually, I do believe that I die, and I do believe that when I die, it's over for me, but I'm like really grateful that I have this period of time in my life now, that makes you much less prone to supernaturalism. And I've certainly experienced people who are like that, I think. Also, by the way, I think your definition of metaphysics is just fine. I'm basically on board with that.
I appreciate that.
That might be because I'm not a physicist, though.
Yeah, thank God for that, because we just wrote it into a book that's about to go on sale. There's another element to this too that. So you have some like really far out experience working with these special operators in the military, and I have long identified with operation. Like as far as I can remember back, like when I was first started really thinking about the world, I just became obsessed with operation, right? So it was classical piano at first, then competitive drumline stuff. I started playing ice hockey, eventually even trying to like go to the best institution in the world and do a PhD. Like it was all about like mastering my ability to operate at these really high levels. But I think there's something weird that happens when you get to the top of some of these mountains, which is that everybody's a really high level expert at some point. And that can make for a sort of clashing of gears where it almost feels like there's no way to expand your understanding because there's nobody to look up to at some points in these fields. And I'm really curious. I heard on Russ's podcast, Econ Talk, you were talking about how they actually sought you out originally because they presumably thought you understood something about the way that their behavior could be improved, their operations could actually be improved. And I have no idea how we're going to tie this to science, but I'm really, really curious about your experience in that world because I also look up to these people, not because I'm a big fan of shooting people in the head or anything, but because they too are operating at this extraordinary level where they just have nobody to look up to. And that's a really fascinating point for me when it comes to sort of charting your future trajectory in the world.
Yeah, okay, so let's come back in a moment to talk about operators and why they're totally fascinating, why they're incredible, and why I think everybody can be an operator, not necessarily in a military context, but to your point, why everyone can have a mission and can kind of, really work hard to develop themselves to become able to achieve on that mission in ways that they never thought possible through a sort of self-discipline, essentially, and really kind of focusing your own narrative around a specific target. So we can talk about all that, but in terms of connecting it to science and why the operators reached out to me, something we haven't talked about in this podcast, and your audience might be wondering why I'm on here, although maybe not, since it sounds to me like you have all sorts of interesting people on here with different backgrounds. But basically, I started out in neuroscience. I started in neurophysiology. What I do is I study how brain cells work and how they communicate with each other. Through the course of doing that, I come to the conclusion, which I thought was obvious, but everyone else thought was nuts, which is that one of the things that neurons do is they create sequences of actions. So that, one neuron leading to another neuron leading to another neuron is basically one action leading to another action leading to another action. This is where new behaviors come from. This is where new activities come from. This is something that computers can't do because computers think in equations, yada, yada, yada. So anyway, so I had this whole theory. And I was working in this neurophysiology lab, and everyone in the neurophysiology lab was like, first of all, Angus, one, this idea is way out there, and you're a very talented young scientist. And, we really think that you should focus on doing things that are kind of a little bit more in the lane, Second of all, even if you did want to do this idea, where are you going to get funding from it? Like, who funds this? Our entire lab is funded by Alzheimer's research. There's nothing in Alzheimer's research which has to do with this, And then, finally, how'd you even design an experiment to work with some of this stuff? These are like really very radically different ideas. What would it even mean to test them? And so I kind of hit this wall in the science community. And what I thought I would do is I thought I would leave science, go get a PhD, essentially in narrative theory in Shakespeare at Yale. And that would equip me to answer questions about narrative better so that I could go back to the science lab and then design experiments more precisely and get the funding and so on and so forth. Of course, what happens is I go to Yale, I do all this stuff, and I realize that it remains unfundable. There's actually no way for me to fund this research because it's still too different. It's still too out there. Every time I have a conversation with scientists, they always say the same thing, which is that, like, you're really brilliant. These ideas are really out there. We don't know. So I then go on this kind of journey, which takes me to working with, folks at places like Pixar and NASA and, all these other things. And I end up as a professor of narrative theory, where I am now at Project Narrative. So I go on this whole loop. But the entire time I've gone on this loop, I've had this totally different theory of the human brain, but I've done absolutely no experiments to test it. And kind of at the bottom of my theory is, if my theory is correct, then there are certain things that you can do that should be able to improve the brain's intelligence. So there are certain exercises and certain practices. And in particular, what these practices should do is improve things like imagination and common sense. And they should help us use our emotions more profitably. So I have all these different theories, but I'm basically locked up in a think tank at a university where I have no research funding. And what happens is I get a phone call one day from U.S. Army Special Operations. And they said to me, and I know you guys will appreciate this, I've shared this with a couple other people, nobody else knows what to make of it, but basically the U.S. Army has this classified intelligence unit. And their job is essentially to solve the problems of the future. And so there's someone inside this intelligence unit that goes around surveying scientific publications for undervalued research. So there actually is someone inside the US Army whose job it is to figure out what is the science of tomorrow that the scientific community is not seeing today. And so I asked them, I was like, how do you do this? Like, what is your method? And they said, we've got a lot of different methods. They said, but the way we found you, Dr. Fletcher, is we noticed that you produce a lot of high quality research in a lot of different journals, and nobody ever cites it. So you're producing all of this research, and it's essentially just dying. And we've noticed that there are, a number of folks like this, and these people are either revolutionaries or cranks because they're producing all this really high quality research that essentially just the community doesn't know what to deal with. And so, we had you on this list of, possible visionaries, possible cranks. And we just kind of had this list kind of kicking around inside U.S. Army Special Operations. And then, one day, one of our, someone was looking at your specific research, and they said, you know what, this actually is research that we can test. And the reason for that is because the basis of my research program is how is it the brain is intelligent with limited information, essentially. And I think that narrative allows you to be intelligent with limited information, whereas computers who run logic cannot be intelligent with limited information. And so in the special operations community, what this means is that you're constantly being thrown out of a helicopter into chaos. You're in these environments that are very volatile, fast changing. So, information is breaking all the time. So they said to me, Angus, if your theories are correct, they would be very useful to us because we could train up our operators to handle these chaos environments better. And so for 3 or 4 years, I kind of got brought behind the veil, started kind of work with some teams. A lot of what we were doing was we were identifying operators who were already very good at these processes and then breaking it down based on my theory into steps that we then trained to other operators to help them lift their processes up. This is something that's quite familiar in sports now, where, a pitcher has a, particularly, speedy fastball, and you kind of break the mechanics down and teach it to other pitchers. And we were doing that on a cognitive level with these narrative processes. It worked. The Army gave me a couple medals. We've since taken that research out and sort of tried it in schools with kids as young as 8. And so sort of what's interesting about my story, and I think this is a story that, is one which, if you're kind of lucky as a maverick, you get to experience, is that even though you're blocked on the traditional pathway, what you're doing is of interest to somebody outside that traditional pathway. And so they kind of pull it over and allow you to use it. And there's an argument to be made that theoretical physics was really useful to the US military, which is why it got developed in the early 20th century. There's also an argument to be made that computers, which nowadays seem ubiquitous, but really were considered to be totally bonkers for most of the early 20th century, were really useful because the U.S. military could build ENIAC, which it thought would be a way to help it predict sort of how artillery shells and their projectiles operated. So I kind of went this route, whereas I got pulled out by the military, and they were like, "We're going to fund this research and kind of give you a chance to test these things." And as a result, I've now become this even weirder figure within the academy because I'm someone who still does not have a lot of folks citing my research because there's like no one to cite it because no one exists in my field. Like I've created a field almost in a way. But on the other hand, everyone is like, "Oh, it's been validated by this outside source." So I don't know if that kind of gives you a little bit of a sense of why the Army was interested, how I contacted the Army. Be happy to talk more about the research I did with them. There's nothing classified about any of it, at least in the specifics of the research itself.
Yeah, I would love to hear about that research a little bit more. I think our audience would love to hear about it too. But one thing you said that was just, I think there's something really sublime buried in there, is that you said that it's difficult to distinguish between revolutionaries and cranks sometimes. And then you basically said that the revolutionaries distinguish themselves by proving useful, perhaps not to the experts in their at the top of their pyramids, but actually useful to people outside of that domain. I mean, those 2 points are really fascinating. I don't even know what to make of it, but it is my experience that it is often on first glance very difficult to tell a crank from a revolutionary.
Yeah. I mean, I still find it impossible. I mean, I've spent a lot of my time, because I'm a pretty open-minded person, I spent a lot of my time talking with people only to realize that they're actually bonkers. And this is not a good idea. And you can figure that out usually. Yeah. And after a while, you're like, oh, okay. Sometimes people can, be bonkers, but also have interesting stuff going on. And that's an interesting subcategory of bonkers. But, there is a rare kind of person who is not bonkers, who actually has a theory that works, but that also just does not fit. It's not even necessarily that it's at odds with the existing system. It's just that it doesn't even fit in the existing system because the existing system is focused on a different set of activities. And in My case, so much of the 20th century has been focused on computation and therefore on optimization. And the idea that there are these kinds of probabilistic mechanisms, folks like Daniel Kahneman, this is sort of all over economics, the Nobel Prize in economics, choice architectures, nudges, all these kinds of things all spring from this idea that you can optimize human behavior, that there are these, probabilistic patterns that can be extracted, that human thought must be Bayesian networks, whatever. Anyway, this is this whole thing. And then when I arrive and I'm like, that's all great, and I'm sure that stuff can work, when you have lots of information and when things can be optimized. But, biologically, optimization is a death trap. The moment anything optimizes biologically, it gets wiped out as a species. Almost all the species that survive are these kinds of generalists. Similarly, when you look at the way that humans work, is our hand optimized? What is our hand optimized for? Absolutely nothing. But it's incredibly useful because you do a lot of different functions. You could optimize a hand if you wanted to, and then as a result, you'd end up with a robot hand, which did one task better than a human hand, but was otherwise useless. Same thing with the human brain, I argue. The human brain is not optimized, unlike a computer. So when you start making arguments like this, people are like, well, okay, that makes sense, but we don't know what to make of that. And, a big part of my claim is that biology is more important than math, and that life is not logical, it is biological, that physics has dominated the last 100 years of scholarship. Someone called Einstein came along and said, hey, we can use statistics to kind of, map Brownian motion. It's a kind of a shortcut. We don't need to look at all the individual molecules. Off of that, what do we get? We get sociology, which is, we can use statistics to map individual people. We don't actually need to look at them as individuals, and you get so much of this stuff coming out of physics. That's where we get demographics. That's where we get identity politics. We get all this stuff coming out of these kinds of foundational physics assumptions. And here's me coming along being like, well, physics is great. And I'm sure that some of these extensions of physics work just fine, and I'm not here to question them, but there's this totally other way of thinking. So that's when you get into this situation where, is this guy brilliant or is he a crank? And I, being inside my own head, know that I'm not a genius. I know that I'm not smarter than most people I interact with. And what that makes me realize is that there's a lot of me's out there. There's a lot of me's out there. And so I'm very open to talking to people. And I constantly encounter this challenge where you can, if someone talks for a long enough time, identify if they are, a little bit off. And the reason for that is because, they haven't just thought through enough objections to their ideas. Really the key to an effective system is the person has really spent a lot of time working through the mechanisms of it. Here's all the stuff that we know. Here's how this system either explains that stuff satisfactorily or doesn't engage with it or provides a better explanation. And the thing about cranks is they almost always, will come down to like a single thing, which somehow explains everything, and they're unable to explain the steps that lead from this single thing to all the other things, but they're really convinced it's this single thing, So there's that. But then there's still lots of people out there that I can't tell if they're cranks or brilliant. And to your point about needing this outside thing, at least in my experience of it, the thing about the United States military, and I've become kind of a big proponent of the United States military, so I apologize to anybody who's not, because I know this is something of a contentious opinion, particularly because our military is used all the time for bad things. And I want to go on the record and say that a lot of the things the U.S. military is used for is very bad, and I do not support those uses of it. But what I love about the United States military is it's constantly being handed problems that are created by the United States government and the United States people. And the United States military is told, you better fix this problem that isn't your problem. And so then the United States military is just radically practical. It's the opposite of a supernaturalist, It's like, how do I fix this problem that I didn't create? Like, I'm just thrown into the middle of it, I've got to build a dam somewhere, I've got to stop these two groups from killing each other. Like, what do I do? And so in their case, they have this great and very open mind that's constantly going out and grabbing stuff, bringing it in, and then very rapidly testing it to see if it works. And they have this huge appetite for saying, and this is what they said to me, what's the fastest way that we can falsify this? What's a test that we can run that if it doesn't work, you're out, And so, that's what they did with me. We ran the test. it didn't fail. So then I got another chance. It didn't fail. So I got another chance. It didn't fail. And that was when I think they started to think, hey, this could work. And so that's what I mean in terms of, needing that outside funding source. And historically in the United States, we've always had multiple places like the NIH and the NSF, you could go to. So there's this sense that you always had this outside thing, but increasingly it's become so centralized. And all of your funding just comes from one or the other, that I think we've lost that ability to kind of rescue the true maverick.
So many things there.
Okay, while Shiloh thinks, I have two questions. One, there is a field that is like creativity studies that roughly seems like it would be related to what you're doing, but you said that you've come up with a completely unique take on it where you're kind of the only guy. So what's the difference?
Yeah, so the backstory to this is that what I basically pitched to the Army is that we were training imagination. And at some point I got asked this question, what's the difference between imagination and ideation? And I said, I don't have the slightest idea. What is ideation? And they said, you don't know what ideation is? I was like, no, I've been in weird business meetings where people have dropped the term, but I have no idea. And they're like, oh my goodness. And like, And so I was essentially forced to learn about the history of ideation, which is the history of creativity studies. And very simply, this goes back to World War II. Again, the United States Army. At this time, the United States Army was actually in charge of the Air Force. And what they had noticed was that some pilots were doing better than other pilots. They were more effective at shooting down other planes. And so the Army's first intuition, as is always the case with the Army, is that the good pilots must have been programmed better. And so they were like, oh my God, we've got to get all the pilots to start following the rules better. And they got like more elaborate textbooks. They told them exactly what to do in any given situation. So all the best pilots would come in and give all their information to the other pilots, and they would be rigorously programmed. And it turned out that the more that the pilots were programmed, the worse that they did, And the Army was like, oh my goodness, this is terribly confusing. Like, what could explain why some pilots are better than other pilots in combat? And then finally somebody raised their hand. They said, I think it's because they're unpredictable. And the Army said, what? And I think it's because they're creative. And, when another plane is coming at them, they do something that's unexpected. And that causes the enemy pilot to freeze or to hesitate, and then our pilot can seize the initiative. And so the Army, having been initially skeptical of this idea, then went all in. And they're like, oh, this is great. So the key to winning in battle is surprise, because it allows you to ambush your enemy by being violent in unpredictable ways. And, the pilots were like, yeah, that's right. And so the Army was like, we got to figure out the secret to this. What's the secret to being creative? And they hired this guy whose name is J.P. Guilford. His first actual name is Joy, but he didn't want anyone to think that he had any joy in him. So he basically insisted that everyone call him J.P. Guilford. He was a professor at the University of Southern California. They hired him, I think, as a lieutenant colonel, and then eventually promoted him to a colonel. And he came up with this theory, which has since become the basis of creativity studies. And very simply, it's that creativity can be reduced to computational processes. And there are two processes: divergent thinking and convergent thinking. And divergent thinking is random. And specifically, it's randomly mixed and matching between different sets. So, if you've got a set of colors and a set of animals, you come up with like blue gorilla and, yellow dolphin or whatever. And so the more you do this, the more, more you're divergently thinking. And then convergent thinking is essentially pattern matching. It's identifying high value probabilities within all these random things that you've created. So divergent thinking plus convergent thinking produces something called ideation, which is the basis of brainstorming and also of generative AI. This is how generative AI works. And so for a long time, really, I would actually say until now, ideation has been accepted as a source of creativity. That's why if you go into any business meeting, they'll talk a lot about ideation. Ideation is the basis of something known as design thinking, which is also something I hadn't spent a lot of time with until I got into business spaces, but people are obsessed with. And it's also how all AI works. So if you ever use an LLM or a chatbot or something, they're running divergent thinking, this kind of randomization thing, and then they're running symbolic logic. Well, one of the reasons the Army called me is because the Army was first through the door on this, but they've realized over the last 25 years, the more that they teach people to ideate, to do convergent thinking and divergent thinking, the worse they get at their jobs. Like, it just doesn't work. And we've kind of known this in business for a while, but no one's really wanted to talk about this. And so, because people want an explanation for creativity, and so, what's happening here? So I essentially collided with the field of creativity studies unintentionally, learned all this kind of stuff, and then said, oh, no, actually, that's not how the human brain works. And it's obvious that that's not how the human brain works for a couple basic reasons. First of all, human creativity is not random. I mean, that's actually the definition of unintelligence. That's the definition of a kind of, brute Darwinian environment where there isn't a brain. Like, you don't need a brain to be random. The purpose of a brain is to be intentional. So, and the human brain doesn't have enough time to just constantly spam out random ideas. If you talk to people who are creative, they're not just randomly coming up with different ideas from different places. I mean, that's why, Van Gogh doesn't suddenly start painting like Renoir or something like that. You know what I mean? Like there's not randomness in creative activity, there's intentionality. So we know that the whole randomness, diversion thinking part is totally wrong. And then we also know that the conversion thinking part is wrong because that's based on probabilities. And probabilities are based on things that have occurred in the past. That's the definition of a probability. It's a correlation of prior events. So that can't lead you to be creative if all you're doing is probabilities. So if what you're doing is randomness plus probability, what you get is what you see in generative AI, which is this kind of like weird kind of iterative tweaking of, pre-existing human creativity, but not real creativity. So anyway, that's ideation. And what we did is we said, actually, instead of taking computers as our model of creativity, we're going to do something totally radical here. We're going to take children as our model of creativity. What is it that children do? What makes them creative? Could it be that they role play? That they imagine themselves as different characters? That they create different story worlds? They tell, possible narratives? Could it be that creativity is in fact not computational, but is narrative? That we often think that narrative is a product of creativity, but maybe creativity is a product of narrative. And so what we basically did was we kind of took this alternative model and we started giving it to special operators, and it was not a hard sell to the special operators because when we got inside their training environments, they have this phrase that training is, quote, role play with real bullets. That's how they refer to their training. So when we were like, we're going to do something totally nuts here, we're going to have you guys imagine that you're not yourselves. They're like, oh, we do that already. I was like, what? And they're like, yeah, that's actually how we are creative. I was like, oh my God. And then we had them read Shakespeare and do all this kind of stuff. And they were like, okay. And amazingly, just as Shakespeare inspired Einstein, inspired Nikola Tesla, inspired Van Gogh, inspired Steve Jobs, Shakespeare also helped make special operators more creative because it's these narrative things. So basically what my lab has done is come up with a completely alternative theory of creativity, which does not fit at all inside creativity studies, which is what explains ideation, whereas what we explain is imagination. And once again, we've had this thing where everyone in creativity studies has been very nice to us because we have this high prestige lab and have the US Army giving us medals and whatnot. But I think really most people in creativity studies kind of wish we would go away because it's like we're sort of just kind of like questioning the entire foundations of the entire field, which is of course how they get their grant money and how they've got their jobs and all the rest of it. And none of them understand at all what I am talking about. I mean, they just don't understand narrative theory. And why should they? Because they haven't been trained in it. And so as a result, we once again have this strange thing where I'm being propped up by the United States Army outside this academic field.
All right, there's a whole place that I want to go to because this role-playing thing is something that I've gotten into with difficult conversations lately. Like, Nasi and I were just on a road trip down to Southern California. We had a really difficult conversation with a cosmologist lined up and a particle physicist from CERN. And before we were going in, like the night before, and even on the drive over to the university, we're sitting there and we're taking turns playing the interviewee. Like, what kind of responses might they give? Because we know we have some challenging information we want to put down. We hope that it'll be a productive conversation. And we're doing this role playing. And of course, when you get in the room, your plans utterly fail, right? Every single possibility, not every single one. Some of the role plays worked out, but there's always going to be pieces of the puzzle that there's no way you could have planned for them. And so maybe we could turn to what it looks like in the face, like, why would you do all this planning if you knew your plans are going to fail anyways? That's it for part 1. With part 2, we'll have a chance to pick Angus's brain about how he has gone about testing these principles in the real world with people operating at the absolute pinnacle of human ability. We'll see you next time.
Whoa, looks like you're backing up a bit here. Okay, Luann? Is there a Luann in the house?
Remember, you don't work here. Young homeowners love to get involved with everything.
Luann going once.
Progressive can't protect you from becoming your parents,
Luann?
but we can protect your home and auto when you bundle with us.
Sorry.
Luann!
Switch to TurboTax and file your own taxes free in the app if you didn't file with us last year. Just file with TurboTax Do-It-Yourself by February 28th. Download now.
Quantum mechanics is weird because despite the fact that we're celebrating its 100th anniversary right now, we still don't understand it. What is really going on in this, our best, most important framework for doing fundamental physics? We understand on the basis of quantum gravity why the Earth moves around the sun or apples fall from trees, but we don't understand what happens when gravity becomes strong, like in a black hole or near the Big Bang. So basically, nature uses every trick that it can think of to make physics work in interesting ways, and it really does give physicists a sense of accomplishment at the end of the day to figure it all out. I'm Sean Carroll. I'm a physicist and philosopher at Johns Hopkins University, host of the Mindscape podcast, and also author of a bunch of books, most recently the Biggest Ideas in the Universe series, including Space-Time in Motion and Quanta and Fields.
How does quantum mechanics work?
I like to think if you were a physicist circa 1895, okay, the very end of the 19th century, you would have been forgiven for thinking that we were almost there. We were almost having a complete theory of nature in our grasp, because they had the idea of particles, right? You know, the idea of an atom was a little bit sketchy to a lot of physicists in the 1800s, but they eventually caught on, and they were beginning to realize that atoms were made of other particles, protons, neutrons, electrons, and so forth. And then the particles, which make up matter, are pushed around by fields, by the electric field, by the magnetic field, by the gravitational field, and so forth. So you have this sort of two-part harmony. Matter is made of particles, forces come from fields, and all the effort in the future of physics would be figuring out what are all the particles, what are all the fields, and then you'd be done. There were a couple of clouds on the horizon. One of them ended up being relativity, the fact that the symmetries of Maxwell's theory of electromagnetism were different than the symmetries of Newton's theory of classical mechanics. But the others were that there were certain properties of matter and materials that didn't quite seem to make sense. And I'm going to be ahistorical now. Let's pop forward to like 1911. They were putting together the picture of the atom that is the cartoon you've always seen, right? There's a little nucleus at the center of the atom, and electrons are circling around it like planets orbiting a star. This is called the Rutherford atom model, after Ernest Rutherford, who was a brilliant experimental and theoretical physicist. And this was entertained, and people liked the idea that electrons were kind of like little planets, but they instantly figured out it can't possibly be right, because that electron orbiting the nucleus would give off electromagnetic waves. It's a moving particle. Moving charged particles give off light. All of the light you're looking at right now came from some electron in motion, moving around. So you can calculate. You can say, if the electron is moving around in orbit around the atomic nucleus, if it gives off light, it will lose energy and spiral into the nucleus. How long should that take? And the answer is every atom in the universe, including the ones in the chair you're sitting on or even in your own body, should collapse to a point in 1/100th of a billionth of a second. So that clearly does not happen. The idea that electrons are like little planets in the solar system is just wrong. And this and other things, black body radiation and other experimental results, convinced people that there wasn't this clean division between particles and forces. They said there's aspects of light, which is supposed to be a wave, which are particle-like. Einstein said that. There are aspects of particles, like electrons, that are wavelength. Louis de Broglie, following work by Niels Bohr and others, said that. And this whole thing coalesces almost exactly 100 years ago, in 1925, in the theory of quantum mechanics. And almost right at the same time, two different versions of it came out. Werner Heisenberg had his version called matrix mechanics. Erwin Schrödinger had his version called wave mechanics. They showed that they were actually mathematically equivalent. But quantum mechanics, I like to say, it was the second of two big ideas in the history of physics. The first big idea in physics was classical mechanics. Relativity is a pretty big idea, but not as big as classical mechanics or the second big idea, which is quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics throws away classical mechanics and replaces it with something very different. It says that electrons are not particles or waves. They act like waves until you look at them, and then they look like particles. That is a very, very difficult thing to swallow, and physicists are still trying to figure out what to make of it. It's so much fun reading the history of how these ideas developed, because today we're just taught the final result, but they didn't know what was going on back in the early days. In 1926, Erwin Schrödinger presents an equation for what we now call the wave function. It's a dopey name for a very important idea. So think of that little electron, instead of orbiting in a circle, it's a wave. It has a profile around the center of the atom. And the equation works very well. It's still the equation that we use today, but then you have to ask, okay, semi-philosophical question, what is the wave function? What is it telling us? And Schrödinger thought, well, okay, in some cases, electrons act like waves. In other cases, they act like particles. Maybe the equation says that if you start with an electron wave all spread out, it will sort of localize itself near some point and it will look like a particle. Turns out not